Well, a very good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Adrian Reed, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this BA Community webinar. I'm really pleased to say we'll be talking about Agile and Business Analysis this evening, which I know is a topic that is dear to many of our hearts, and in fact is an area which causes lots of controversy and questions. So with that in mind, I'm really pleased to say that we have a panel of experts in Agile and Business Analysis with us here this evening to answer any questions that you might have. And I know that there are lots of questions because a whole range of questions have been submitted even before the webinar has started. So it's clearly a topic that is on the front of people's minds. However, if you do have questions that crop up throughout the session, please do type them into the Q&A window. We'll answer as many questions as we can throughout the session. So I will very, very briefly introduce our three speakers. Our first panelist is Lynda Girvan, lead Agile Business Analyst at CMC Partnership. You may well know Lynn. She co-authored a book on Agile and Business Analysis, which was published by BCS. You may well have heard Lynn speak at an Agile or indeed a Business Analysis conference in the UK or around Europe. We also have Tony Heap, an experienced Agile Business Analyst, Agile coach, Agile trainer, author of many white papers. Do check out his website and his blog, and a regular conference speaker on topics related to agility and design. And Tony describes himself, I think I'm right in saying Tony describes himself as a requirement denier, which I think is a fantastic phrase, which I'm sure we may come on to. And last but by no means least, we have Chris Matz. Chris is an Agile Transformation Coach, international keynote speaker and author of books such as Commitment. He was also a contributor to the Business Analysis Body of Knowledge Guide, the BA-Bot Guide. And again, I'm sure many of us will have seen or heard Chris speak at a conference or an IIBA event somewhere. So a very warm welcome. Thank you, Lynn, Tony and Chris for joining us. So our agenda for this evening, we're going to start with a very brief intro from each of our panelists, where we're going to ask them to just outline how they would describe Agile. Then we've got a very brief presentation from each of our panelists, where they're going to talk through some particular angles of Agile and Business Analysis, which they think are particularly pertinent and relevant. But then the real meat of the session is the panel discussion. So do get those questions coming in. And then we'll close with some final thoughts. So without further ado, our intro, our first question to our panelists. If you had to describe Agile to someone who had never heard of it before, how would you describe it? So I will pick on Tony first. Tony, how would you describe it?
Thanks, Adrian, and hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. So I'm going to answer it assuming the person I'm speaking to knows about software development and has probably worked in a waterfall environment. So what I'm going to say is then that Agile is a way of delivering software that appears to work better than waterfall, which is the previously popular approach. So in contrast to waterfall, which tends to deliver software in big bangs, so infrequently and large chunks of functionality or indeed entire systems all at once, the central premise of Agile is to deliver software frequently in small batches, and this is what we call incremental delivery. Okay, couple of benefits there: deliver useful software sooner, and it also allows us to see whether it works as expected, and if not, to adjust it. So we call this iterative delivery. So incremental bit by bit, and iterative means going back and reworking things that don't work. Okay, Agile promotes all sorts of other techniques as well that have been found to improve delivery incomes: small teams, co-located teams, high levels of collaboration, lightweight on the documentation, focus on face-to-face conversation, a whole bunch of other stuff as well, responding to change. So when things don't work, change them. When the business context changes, move to adapt to that. Now, sounds very counterintuitive, okay? Sounds undisciplined, possibly wasteful. What's all this rework about? I've got an analogy which is with market-based versus planned economies, okay? So market-based economy sounds a bit bonkers, we're going to say that we're going to have multiple independently controlled copies of all of our key industries, supermarkets, farms, smartphone manufacturers. We're going to put them all in competition with one another. They're all going to build pretty much the same thing and have a battle to see who's the best. That just sounds incredibly wasteful, doesn't it? Why not have a planned economy where we just have one of everything, centrally controlled and coordinated? That sounds a lot more sensible. And yet history tells us the market economy works a whole load better. And it's likewise with Agile. Even if it seems counterintuitive, it turns out to work better. So that's my definition.
Fantastic, Tony. Thank you very much. So I will next pick on Lynda. Lynn, if you could give us your perspective.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. So I agree with everything Tony said. And I guess I'd like to add to that Agile really is a mindset. I think there's too much focus on Agile being about methodologies such as Scrum. But actually, without the mindset, there is no Agile. So Agile, first and foremost for me, is really about a way of thinking. It's a mindset. And I think that this mindset actually challenges traditional management and planning approaches, especially project management, where a lot of traditional project management might say fail to plan, plan to fail. Well, Agile isn't saying don't plan, it's saying but plan in a slightly different way. It's about ensuring that work is developed collaboratively in order to have the best chance of being of value. So we talk about delivering value, but it's actually about making sure that it's of value. It is of value and it's proved to be of value. It also assumes that you can't know at the start of the project what is actually needed. So the ideas or the concepts or the work needs to evolve as you understand more and unveil more information. This leads itself to short iterations, enabling early sight of working solutions, the solutions that enable the customer to provide feedback and hence adjust and change their minds about what they actually need. In this way, the customer gets early value based on what's important to them now, not what they, so they're not forced to plan in advance for what they will need 12 months from now. So Agile is really about, making sure you work collaboratively, you get short feedback cycles, you're ensuring that you're delivering things that the customer says is of value through those feedback loops, and making sure that you do that in an iterative way throughout.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Lynn. So we've got some really interesting themes emerging already. We've heard from Tony about the iterative and incremental side of things, and it's perhaps counterintuitive, but it works. We've heard Lynda's mentioned that it's a mindset, and actually it's about value and the evolution and discovery as we go along. So Chris, what can you add to two very, very comprehensive opening gambits already?
So first, I'd like to add that Tony stole my script. I was actually going to say that the big difference between kind of waterfall and Agile is it's about delivering things in small increments rather than big. So, if you're a property developer, instead of building 12 houses and at the end of the year trying to sell 12 houses, you would build one full complete house, try and sell it in the market, see whether you can sell it. If you do, you then build another house and then you try and sell it, etc. So Tony stole my script and I've frantically been kind of trying to think of something interesting to say. So I think one of the things that I always think about with the Agile movement, and if you look at the manifesto says we're uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. And I think what it was at the time, I was doing business analysis and project management in the 1990s. And the way we did it there was someone in a university, an academic, would kind of put on a pointy hat, or someone in IBM labs would put on a pointy hat, and they'd decide how we're going to build software, and they'd tell us all how to do it. And we'd just struggle and really couldn't work out how to make these things work properly. And I think the big thing about that manifesto, the big thing for me about Agile was we stopped doing that. We stopped saying, hey, what's the academics telling us? And we said, let's look around the company and find out who's doing software well, and let's just copy what they're doing. So one of the big things was that it was about a practitioner-led, harvesting things that work, some of which are very counterintuitive, as Tony says, instead of a theoretical this is how it should work, go off and it'll all work. It was, no, we're not doing that. We're only really going to copy the people who are successful at delivering software, work out why they're successful, and copy that. And one of the big things for that is let's deliver small bits, lots of small bits, rather than one big bit.
Fantastic, thanks Chris. So we've got that whole iterative, incremental, we've got mindset, we've got value, we've got things evolving, and the ability for ideas to come later, and the fact it's practitioner led, not just theory based, and the really chunking down to small chunks. So really good perspective there between us. So thank you very much for those opening gambits. So we will move swiftly on to our conversation starters. So each of our panelists have very kindly put a few slides together to talk through elements of Agile and Business Analysis which felt particularly pertinent to them. So Lynda, if I could invite you to go first, and I'll just bring up your first slide.
All right, thanks very much. So this question was really about what does Agile and Business Analysis mean, or Agile Business Analysis. I've been an analyst all my life. I started out as an intelligence analyst. I've done systems analysis, data analysis, going right the way back from about 1989 onwards. Analysis is so important that we all do it in our day-to-day lives. You wouldn't buy a car or a house without doing some analysis. Yet I find increasingly when we get into the software world, and especially with some Agile teams, people jump straight into coding or whatever without actually thinking about what problem they're trying to solve, without doing some upfront analysis. And so I think here lies the thing about what is analysis and what do we mean by Agile analysis. Well, we talk about continuous implementation, continuous build, continuous integration when we talk about things such as DevOps, as I've shown on these slides. But actually, I think we need continuous analysis too. Whenever we integrate things and deploy them, we need the feedback loop to go back and actually say, well, did we actually achieve the goal that we were trying to achieve with the work that we were doing? Has that presented new problems and opportunities? And we need to do some analysis around that to ensure that it's aligned with the business goals and what the business is doing or what the organization wants. And this presents itself with new ideas and concepts which may come onto the backlog. So it's not just about continuous build and test and continuous integration. It's actually about continuous analysis. So I think continuous analysis is really important, but we cannot afford to spend weeks and months doing analysis either. We can't afford anymore to do analysis paralysis. I think I remember working in a rational unified process project where we started celebrating inception. Inception is the phase where you do a lot of the upfront analysis. We've been doing that for 12 months. And in that 12 months, we were out celebrating the fact that we had delivered nothing. And I remember scratching my head at the time thinking, why are we doing this? So for me, analysis is about just enough analysis, just in time. It's about understanding how to prioritize what you're doing, to be able to work collaboratively with the customers, to be able to identify what needs to be done first, and then do that continuous feedback loop and do continuous analysis throughout. So analysts or business analysts or analysts, doesn't matter if it's a dedicated business analyst or somebody doing business analysis, needs to adopt an agile approach to their analysis work. That means taking on the agile mindset and adopting the agile mindset in their analysis work. This doesn't mean throw the baby out with the bathwater with some of the diplomas in business analysis or with any of the business analysis techniques that have been around for years. It's actually applying those in an agile way. It's actually making sure you do just enough, just in time. It's also being able to ensure that you can apply the agile principles in the work that you do. So rather than saying I'm the one that goes and speaks to the users, it's about facilitating the collaboration, ensuring that that collaboration is happening throughout the development work. It's actually making sure that you're open to new approaches and ideas. There's loads of techniques out there that analysts can use to actually enable them to work in a more agile way. We use things such as lean thinking, design thinking, lean startup. All of this, it really is about making sure we get the backlog right to start with, making sure that the backlog actually contains items of value and not technical tasks. Because if it's technical tasks, then it's going to deliver technology, not deliver business value. And so it's really about ensuring all of those things are done. For me, an agile analysis has the business thinking approaches, which is the next slide. So, agile analysis for me is about applying agile values and principles in everything you do. It's about taking your existing business analysis toolkit, which you should continuously add to and always be adding to, and apply those tools in an agile way, just enough, just in time. And it's about applying business thinking approaches such as lean thinking, making sure that we're not creating waste in our analyst activities. Upfront requirements, for instance, is waste in its own right, because probably only 40-50% of those requirements will actually ever get delivered. So that's 50% waste straight away. Systems thinking, ensuring that you have a whole system approach, that the technology isn't just delivering technology, but it's delivering business outcomes aligned with processes and people and structures and policies and all of the other things that enables change or change projects to be successful. And also service thinking. And this is about understanding who your customer is as an analyst. Understanding that you have project customers, but even as an analyst you have individual customers. And if I'm producing artifacts as an analyst, like use cases or models or whatever the artifact that I'm producing, that I've engaged and I thought, who is the customer for this artifact? What do they want? When do they want it? How much detail do they want? And I think there's often the case that a lot of developers actually get quite infuriated with business analysts who either bring not enough information or too much information. And my question is, well, why didn't you ask them what they wanted? And that the only way you can know just enough, just in time, is to ask the person who is going to be receiving the artifact or the information from you what is just enough, just in time, and understanding who your customer is. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Lynda. So just enough, just in time, a real understanding of the consumer of the artifacts. We've got an expanded toolkit. We've got the principles. We've got continuous analysis. Fantastic. It's a really nice picture. So moving on to Chris. Let me just bring up your first slide, Chris.
Okay, thank you, Adrian. So I think we're all familiar with this process. We do the analysis, design, code, test, and production. And when I first started out as a business analyst, it would be, we'd spend 3 months doing analysis or 6 months doing analysis, another 3 months doing the design. We'd crush the code into 3 months. We'd then do testing 3 months, and then we'd spend 3 months getting it out into production. So if we move to the next slide, what we did in Agile is we did that stuff, but instead of taking a year to do it or 2 years, we did it in a month. So we'd still do the analysis, still do the design, do the code, the test, and the production. And what I want you to think about is, what is the risk profile from the perspective of the business investor? Yeah. So if we can look at the next slide. So this is, if you're a business investor, you're paying for the project, you invest money, you invest and you invest, and you never really know where you are until you go into production. And that's when you find out whether this thing that you've built is actually going to work or not. So this is the risk profile for a kind of traditional waterfall style project. We go to the next slide, we see the risk profile of an Agile project. So we invest a bit of money, and then we find out where we are. And then we invest a bit of money and we find out where we are. And for me, the key thing is that we get into production. So it's pretty common these days to encounter a flagship project, the flagship Agile project, where they're doing 2-week sprints in Scrum, and they've been going for 2 years and they haven't done a single production release. And the thing is, in order to get the risk management, you need to be getting stuff into production and getting feedback, because when we talk about risk in IT projects, what we're normally talking about is delivery risk. Is it on time, to budget, to scope? But from a business investor, there are actually 3 categories of risk, not just delivery risk. There's also business case risk and risk to the existing business model. And the thing about doing this Agile thing is we put something live and we can get feedback on the other 2 as well. And after 3 iterations, we get there's a number of scenarios that can happen. We might find that actually we can't build the thing, so we kill the project. Or we might find that we've actually it's not delivering the value we expected. The customers don't like it, or the business people are doing it, and we're not coming back with the value that we expected, so we kill the project. Or we might find after 3 iterations out of the 12 that we intend to do, that we've delivered all the value that we expected to do, and so we kill the project. We move all the people onto another project because this is the most successful project we've ever done. Instead of taking a year to do it, in 3 months we've delivered all the value. Or after that 3rd iteration, we discover that the customers love it so much that we invest even more. And the business analyst in this world is not just someone who sits and writes down the requirements. The business analyst is a risk mitigation tool. And as you're doing the analysis, if you're sitting there and going, you know what, am I actually mitigating the risk here? And if you're not, you stop. Because if what you're doing isn't actually helping us better understand the problem, or you're not getting insight to the customers, we stop and we move on to the next stage. So if we go on to the next slide, one of the things I've encountered, which is I found to be very useful, it took me about 10 years to get my head around it, is Cynefin by Dave Snowden. And if you're interested, what I recommend is go onto YouTube and video, look for Cynefin and Dave Snowden, and there's a dozen or so videos that you can watch where he's giving keynotes at conferences, and he explains this model. And I would advise the first that you listen to a lot of them. You got to listen to 5 or 6 because he uses kind of a very precise language, and it takes you a couple of those watches to actually get past the language. But what he's saying basically is that the world is split into two things. You've got the things that are knowable. You do something and you can know what the outcome will be. And then you've got the unknowable. So you do stuff, but you won't know what the outcome is, or as I tend to call it, emergent. Now, in the knowable space, there are some things that are just obvious. So, for example, we want to put an extra field on a report. Well, everyone just knows that. And then there are some things that are complicated. So, okay, there's a new tax that's been introduced, or we're going to do Brexit and we need to work out what the impact is on our organization. And for complicated things, it's a case of we need to either speak to an expert, a subject matter expert, or we need to do analysis to work out what's needed. But the key thing is that the outcome is knowable. We then get to the unknowable, and that's split into 2. That's the complex space and the chaos. And in complex, we've got enough information to have some hypotheses about what's going to happen, but we don't know for certain. And so what we'll do is we'll come up with multiple safe-to-fail experiments to actually work out what's going to happen. And safe-to-fail is key because we don't want to do something that will, kill the project or kill the firm. Chaos is when we have no idea and we just need to act. And so why is this relevant to business analysis? So if you're looking at something and it's in the obvious domain, you just tell the developers to get on with it. Why are we as business analysts getting involved where stuff's obvious? Because this is what gets us a bad rep. Just get the devs and say, look, anyone can see that and understand it. Just get on with it. In the complicated domain, that's our sweet spot. That's where we've got a toolkit that will allow us to deep dive and delve into what is needed. We can talk to the business. We can ask them, right, if we produce this report or if we produce this process, we understand what we're trying to achieve. And that's our bread and butter. And that's where we should be all over it. Now, the complex space is where it gets interesting because there's a lot of people who say, oh, I'm a business analyst. And what I'm talking about now is the toolkit of business analysis. That's in complicated. A lot of business analysts also play in the complex space. So this would be where we have no idea if what we're going to do is going to improve things. So we're trying to get more customers for our website, trying to increase the number of customers, or we're trying to increase the number who convert from non-paying customers to paying customers. And we can try experiments, but we can't know for certain whether they'll succeed or not. And so this is where the product, what I call the product management toolkit, which is about putting ideas out there, seeing what they want. user experience research, it's about user experience testing, it's about speaking to the users and all this study of the users and personas, and that's in that complex space. And then in the chaos space, this is where we just need really knowledgeable people just to act. And so my takeaway from this slide is really understand that if the task you're given is obvious, just give it to someone to get on with it and don't get in the way. If it's complex, understand that that analysis isn't really going to help you. You're just going to have to try things and see what works. In chaos, you're going to have to act. But understand that our sweet spot with those analysis skills is that complicated domain. What are the things that we need to do for our organization as a result of Brexit? What are the things we need to do if there's a new tax? And at that point, I'm going to hand back to Adrian.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Chris. And I would echo. I would certainly echo Chris's point about looking up the Cynefin framework and Dave Snowden's YouTube videos. There are some fantastic ones on there, and I've found this a real eye opener for me personally as well. So really good to see it sort of come into this conversation. So fantastic. So moving on, last and by no means least, Tony, what can you add to our very comprehensive sort of elaboration from our other panelists?
Okay, so Agile style, I'm going to adapt my talk completely from what I'd said I was going to say. In fact, I'm going to insert a little bit in before talking about these different levels. So if you imagine for an Agile business analyst to have a strap line, you know, that little bit that goes below your title, as it were, that companies often have, I'm going to say that Agile business analyst helping the product owner decide what to build. Okay, so and the product owner, of course, is a reference to Scrum. In Scrum, the product owner is the person who decides what to build. And in Scrum, there's no mention of a BA or indeed any real analysis that needs to happen other than perhaps a little bit of backlog grooming. Now, you know, we've since discovered that there's a bit more to it than that. So the BA is helping the product owner decide what to build. That wording, deciding what to build, that's a great phrase. It came from Alistair Cockburn, one of the Agile manifestees, in his desperate attempt to get rid of the word requirement. Adrian mentioned that I'm a requirement denier, and I absolutely am. I hate that word. It just implies that things are set in stone and they must happen, whereas actually what you've got is a bunch of hypotheses, to Chris's point, that need testing with users, that need putting out there to see if they work. So deciding what to build, and then a little suffix to that as well, to build the right thing. So in Agile, we sometimes talk about building the thing right and building the right thing. The BA is very much in the space of let's build the right thing. So let's build things early that mitigate risks and find out, you know, if we are building the right thing. So that's the strap line. Now, as a business analyst, an Agile business analyst, what do I actually do day to day? Okay, so as perhaps a new business analyst or new to Agile, there's three levels. Okay, so I'm going to go through basic, medium, and higher. So if you're just getting to grips with Agile business analysis, there you go. Then basic level, helping the team design stories properly, okay, by making sure they've thought through the system behavior properly. So Chris made a point that some stories are obvious. It's a field on a report. They can probably crack on without a lot of thinking through. But a lot of stories involve system behavior. Click here, this happens. Click there, that happens. Enter data in a field. What happens if the data I've entered is invalid? What happens if I've left the field empty and then clicked on the button to continue? Thinking through the alternative flows. In old school analysis terms, we used to talk about use cases for describing behavior. More recently, it's quite common to use BDD scenarios, given when then, which Chris, who's also on the panel here, was one of the people who came up with that idea. So good work there. Making sure, as I said, particularly all the alternative flows are thought through. So if you were just looking to add basic level value as a business analyst, making sure those scenarios are correctly articulated is a good thing. Okay. Next level up, okay, I mentioned backlog grooming. So prioritization is key. If you're going to deliver the high value stuff first, or the risk mitigating stuff first, then prioritization. That's a really, really important skill. Okay. So that's intermediate level. Story splitting as well is an intermediate skill, and it goes hand in hand with prioritization. So what you tend to find is you've got big chunky epics on your backlog, and within each epic there's some high value stuff and there's low value stuff. Split that epic into two, put the high value stuff at the top of the backlog, put the low value stuff in a thing called phase 2 at the bottom of the backlog, and you're heading towards delivering the right thing, delivering the high value stuff, the risky stuff first. Okay, so that's my intermediate level Agile business analyst. Expert level then, so if you think you've got those first two nailed, starting then to introduce to the team discovery on stories. So Chris's example there showed analysis, design before build. Okay, so part of that analysis piece, discovery, is, have we got the right stakeholders in the room, and do we truly understand what the objective of this particular story is? Somebody said, as a somebody, I can do something, but that do something, really, is that the only do something that's going to achieve the objective that's in the so that part? Are there other ways of doing it? Considering alternative options, considering cheaper options or better options, or tactical options, an MVP version of the story. Getting the team to start doing that and brainstorming ideas at every level, at epic level, at tiny story level. Is that button blue? Is it green? Is it even a button? Is it a link? Are we going to do this as an automated process? Is it going to be a manual process? Is it going to be a bit of a mixture? How's it going to work? That's, I think, when you're starting to add huge chunks of level of value. Okay, so that's my 2 pennies, actual practices that a BA can do day in, day out to add value to the team.
Fantastic, thanks very much, Tony. And it was interesting when you were describing that expert level of really understanding different options and understanding the needs. I was sort of thinking about that whole the typical, we just need a new field on a report, but actually we might find that actually what they're looking for is they're actually looking to make an informed decision.
Yeah, exactly. What's that field for? What do you want the field for? Why do you need it? Is it a field on a report? Is it something else?
Exactly. Is the data stored in the right format to actually to help you make the decision that you need to make? So interesting. Okay, fantastic. So we will move on now to the main event, which is the Q&A panel discussion. And we have so many questions coming in. Please do keep them coming. There's a good chance we won't be able to answer all the questions live, but we'll answer as many as we can. And when there are similar themes, I'll bundle them together so we can cover as much ground as possible. So you might hear your question merged with another question. So we will start at the very beginning with I think what is quite a fundamental question, actually. And I'll address this one to Lynda in the first instance, but then we'll open this up. And it's a fairly simple to say, but probably hard to answer question. But what role should a BA play on an Agile project?
That's like the $1 million question, isn't it?
It really is.
I think it depends, and I don't think there is a one size fits all. I mean, Chris talked about the Cynefin, and I think it depends on whether you're in the chaos or whether you're in the complex or whatever. For me, I think whatever role you're in, whatever size of the project, whether it's complex or whatever, and sometimes it won't be a dedicated business analyst. I think that's really, really important. I do not advocate that every project should have a dedicated specialist business analysis, but I do advocate that people must have some business analysis skills on any type of project. So what role should I guess I'll answer this as what role should a dedicated business analysis professional play on an Agile project? And I think there are a couple of areas here. I don't know if I want to delve into the product owner role just yet, but let's talk about the role that the BA actually plays. In a complex environment, there is some upfront analysis that needs to be done before we can actually work out what the problem is that we're solving. And there does need to be some analysis done by somebody who has some skills that can collaborate and bring people into the problem, think about what the changes are, and think about what the different types of change are around different aspects of the organisation. So this is assuming that the analysis is being done before a project has actually been stood up. This is about working in the business space and saying, what is the problem? Maybe using some, in that sort of space, and saying how are people affected by this? What sort of areas of the IT or information and technology are being affected, and looking at all of the different areas of what we call the POPIT model, or PPITF, if you like to think of it that way, that are affected on that project. Then if you go into a project space, let's say you've got a business case, you've got a PID, you're working in a project as a dedicated BA, I would argue there's not enough work for you to do full time. So you have to become more T-shaped. You have to be more adapt to work in different environments, in different areas, or you need to be working across multiple projects. So in a software development team, there is probably not enough work for a dedicated specialist business analyst to be working 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. If you are working in a project team, though, it's about making sure, and this is some of the things I'll draw on what Tony said, it's about making sure the backlog contains items that are value or valuable. They're business value things. So it's being able to split them down from large things to small things to work items, ensuring each work item has some value in it from the business perspective, and preventing the backlog from becoming just a list of technical tasks. If we deliver just technical tasks, we'll deliver technology, but we won't deliver change within organisations, or we may not deliver things that are actually of value to the business or the customer. If you're working in a dedicated Scrum team or something like that, there's an opportunity for business analysts to support the product owner. I think there's another question about product owner, but I believe that they become the critical friend, supporting and ensuring that the product owner has thought through a lot of the things. If we do this, will it break other processes? Do we look at the system that we're working in and thinking about, does it affect other systems? Can we do some customer journey mapping that sits across this, and maybe looking at touch points with other systems within the organisation that are affected by this change? Being the critical friend to the product owner, ensuring they're asking the right questions and they're making the right priority calls is really, really critical in all of this. I think there's plenty of opportunity as well for business analysts to become far more T-shaped in this environment, thinking about developing their UX design skills, thinking about where they sit within the testing, how they do UAT testing on that particular iteration or that sprint, if you'd like. So I think there's much scope, and including things like writing BDD scenarios and all those things. I think there's plenty of scope for business analysts to be gainfully employed within a project, but not just in the upfront. Front loading the project, but throughout, right the way through to it being tested and making sure that what went out in that iteration was actually of value and it was actually implemented.
Fantastic, thanks, Lynn. A really quite useful and broad answer there, and that T-shaping certainly really resonates, I think. So, okay, so Chris, so perhaps building on Lynn's ideas there, so thinking about what the role that the BA should play on an Agile project, but a related question we've had is, how do you see the BA fits in Scrum with respect to the product owner role? So have you got any thoughts, Chris, on BA, product owner, and BA generally in Agile, but specifically Scrum?
I really want to build on what Lynda said, because the key thing for me is that the business analysis is a toolkit rather than particularly a role. But you often do find that there are business analysts on roles. And so much of last year, I was working with a client where the product owner, we'd kind of have a product owner team and the development team. They were all one team, but rather than it being a product owner as a person, there was a team of people. And the reason is because we're working in a very complex environment now. So that product owner, there was a product owner who basically was accountable to the business to actually ensure that value was delivered. There's a UX researcher who's kind of understanding the customers. There's a UX designer. There's an interface designer. There's a systems thinker, because we're working with call centers. There's a service designer to making sure that the whole thing's like, And there's a business analyst in the team as well. And what you find is that the business analyst is there, and they are, you know, they're working very closely with the product owner. They're making sure that they've got good quality data. So one BA was making sure that the data that the product owner was making decisions on was good quality, and they were finding the right data to actually help them make those decisions. But they were also then interfacing with the team, and they were almost like the product owner for the development team, in terms of they were the one making sure the stories were of a good format to go in. Because quite often you'll find that if you're dealing with UX designers and UX researchers and kind of UI designers, they're great at coming with the visual designs and the process, but they're not so great at necessarily interfacing with the development team. And the other thing is that the BAs are often got very disciplined, and they're also very good at facilitation. And what we would find is that there was one great meeting we had where I said, right, okay, we just want to go through the process, but the BA facilitated the discussion using the given, when, then format, working backwards. And they said, right, so we're going to do the then first, then the when, then the given. So what's the very last thing that the customer does? What's the very last thing the customer said? And all the product owner team were going, no, we don't need this. We all know, we all agree. And he said, okay, what is the very last thing that they do? And by applying that kind of business analysis rigor to take the vague and fluffy of the design and get it something really detailed that the development team could work with, we realized that when we started this conversation, it took them an hour to decide what was the last thing. So he said, that then, the given, when, then, what is the then? It took them into an hour to decide. And then, no, but it's okay, we know the rest. And then we said, okay, so when? What is the trigger for that event? And they spent another half an hour arguing over that. So I think the business analysis toolkit is incredibly valuable on an Agile project. Whether you're playing a BA role or whether you've kind of got another job title, I think the BA skills are always going to be very valuable. And as I say, what I often see is either if it's a complicated project, you may see that the BA is the product owner. On a complex product where we're perhaps trying to understand the business, it's likely that the BA is going to be supporting the product owner as a very close confidant. And so, yeah, there's a it is very much about the context as to whether the BA is the product owner or the BA is in a massively important supporting role to the product owner.
Fantastic. So the old cliche but true that context is king. We've got it's the role and not the job title, and very much about that context. So thanks very much, Chris. So Tony, I'd be curious to know if you've got anything to add, but also I'm going to inject a sort of another question at this point as well. So I'm interested in your views on the role a BA should play, or the role analysis should play. But also another question we've had, which is sort of related, is what do you feel is the simplest yet most effective skill for someone new to an Agile BA role to practice? So if you could think about the role of the BA in Agile, but also the simplest yet most effective skill. Quite a tricky one to answer.
Oh, it's easy. It's actually quite easy. And I noticed someone else has also asked a question, which I will answer by answering this question. So what should a BA do? Now, first of all, it's worth mentioning every project's different, and also every BA is different. Every BA style is different. So Lynda and Chris and I might operate very differently, even on the same project. I'm a bit of a detail guy. I like getting into the detail and working out the nitty-gritty of things. Yeah, so exactly what the system behavior is going to be, what the data fields are going to look like, how many characters will there be in an address field, all that kind of stuff. Because someone's got to do that. Someone's got to think that stuff through, and it might sound a bit dull and unsexy. But if you don't do it before development, then the questions will just come up during development. And that might be okay, but in some cases, agreeing it up front helps matter. So following my strapline from before, helping the product owner decide what to build on a kind of day-to-day level, I'm going to say getting stories ready for development. So if you're going to run Scrum, for example, you need stories ready for development to go into a sprint. And that means that you have a good idea, a detailed idea of what they're going to, what the scope of them is and how big they are. So you've done some kind of estimation as well. Now, for me, the by far the best way of doing that, and the most basic skill, but an underrated skill perhaps, is writing acceptance criteria, and in particular scenarios, okay? So we used to call them use cases. We call them scenarios now. We call them BDD scenarios. So someone asked, what's a BDD scenario? BDD stands for behavior-driven development. Chris has also referred to it as given, when, then, but it's really, really, really simple. All you're doing is watching and describing somebody using a system, two things interacting, usually a person and a system, maybe a system and a system, maybe a person and a person, and it's really simple. It's like a script. So user requests to log on, system displays the logon screen or asks them for their logon details, user types in their login details and clicks login or says there's my details. Sometimes you try and avoid predefining the screen layout in it, so you might not say clicks a button, but you might say request to log on. System checks the details, or no, so mistake, system logs the user in. Hang on a minute, what if they've put the wrong details in? Aha, system checks the details, and if they're correct, the system logs the user in and displays the welcome page. Now, alternative scenario, user enters the wrong login details. System says, I'm sorry, that's wrong. Would you like to try again? Or alternatively, maybe you need a password reset or a password reminder or something like that. Aha, another alternative flow. User request for a password reset. So what happens next? That is writing, that's describing the system behavior, the interactions between the user and the system, and thinking through all of those alternative flows. For me, that is the most useful basic skill you could have, and that's a really good role for a BA to play. Now, key point here, in the good old days, analysts went away and did analysis on their own and wrote documents and then handed them over to the team to build. Agile says, look, that's not the best way of doing things, right? Face-to-face conversations are good. Collaboration is good, okay? So it's a combination of working around the table with everyone. Chris talked about doing it up on a whiteboard with a team of product owners. That's absolutely spot on. I'm a bit of a mixture. I like to go away and think about things myself, maybe do a bit of a prep work, and then get together with the team and discuss, right, here's a flow, here's an alternative flow there. Can anyone think of any more alternative flows? Tricky balance between the two, I think. But that's my answer, writing behavior scenarios.
Fantastic, thanks, Tony. And actually, this is probably a good opportunity to bring Chris in briefly, because in terms of given, when, then, if I recall correctly, that's yours, isn't it, Chris?
Well, I'd just like to say, anyone listening out there who really enjoys working with given, when, then that was me. And if you find it caused you a great deal of pain in your life, then it was Dan North.
Fantastic response.
And but the big trick, the one I'll give away for free, which is kind of like my secret little trick, is, and to your point about the kind of like getting the stories of value and so on, it's to understand that the value is in the output that's produced. And if you produce the output, you can then speak to the person who's going to consume that output and say, how is that of value to you? And you can have that conversation. And then once you've established that output, you can work backwards. And if you can work backwards, it makes the process so easy. When you're working forwards, it gets to be a lot harder.
Fantastic. Thanks for those useful words of wisdom there, Chris.
But if you like it, it was me. And if you didn't, it was me.
But that's interesting and almost counterintuitive, Chris. It makes me think, because I tend to think from start to finish. So if I want to log into the system, what's the first thing that's going to happen to me? And I kind of work my way towards the image to the end goal, but with the end goal in mind. Your idea is really interesting, isn't it? Kind of work back from the end goal, and it makes perfect sense now you say it.
Yeah. And then what happens is you'll have this thing and you go, given that I'm logged in, and you just assume it's logged in, and the developers can have a mock object to replicate that. And normally the login is something that's kind of not considered risky for the project. But if you work the other way, you end up building a login, which is a low risk thing.
Yeah. Build it first.
Build it first. Whereas if you build the last thing, which is the thing that the customers want, normally the biggest problem is you give something to the customer and they don't want it.
There's also no value in login either, is there? Nobody logs in for no reason. They always do it for a reason. See, it's the reason they're logging in that you want to test. There's the value, isn't it? Not the actual ability to log in.
Yeah. And when you start with given I'm logged in rather than working forwards, you can then start to think, okay, well, what are other ways that I can get logged in? And I think this is perhaps where, I think it was NatWest a few years ago said, rather than having to have your card, if you've lost your card, you can ring your normal telephone banking and they'll give you a code that you can go and enter into a cash point and get money out.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So it can be a spur for that kind of innovation as well. So, okay, so lots and lots of questions coming in. And again, if we don't answer your question live, apologies. This has generated so many questions coming through. But this one I'm going to address to Lynn. And it's a fairly, again, a simple question to ask. It might be a tricky one to answer. But it is Agile just for software?
Oh God, no, not at all. And I think this is, I mean, as you were talking about the use cases and BDD and scenarios in general, I was in my mind thinking about, how I use scenarios. And I think that there's a distinction here, isn't there, between user scenarios and usage scenarios, and they're quite different. And I think BDD is really in the usage, specific usage of a thing, whereas user scenario is a bit more sort of broad and general. And for me, I think there's lots of user analysis that can happen at a much higher level. So as an analyst, I've worked on transformational change programs, huge programs of work that have not delivered IT, and I can apply an agile mindset when I do that. And I do that by thinking about, can I understand what the problem is? Can I do some analysis to prioritize what I can deliver first to test a hypothesis? You can still test the hypothesis, whether it's a change hypothesis or whether it's a software hypothesis. So for me, the actual concepts around agile really need to be applied at a much broader level, or can be applied at a much broader level. And actually, if you've got analysts that are working in a sort of portfolio level, then you want them to be agile in the way they do the analysis. Otherwise, we never get to the point that we can deliver software, because we've never done enough analysis to get through any of the chaos to figure out what we can deliver first to test a hypothesis, because we haven't worked out what the hypothesis is. So it's all proving or disproving whether something can work, and that can be applied just as much in a change environment as it can in a technology or software environment.
Yeah, but I probably wouldn't use Agile to build a skyscraper.
Well, that's still a physical product. I was thinking more about, within organizations, about delivering transformation and delivering change, and about saying, well, what can we deliver early to prove whether this change is going to work, and what have we learned from that change, and then what can we deliver next to build on that. And again, it's all about, for me, it's about reducing complexity in order to hit risk early on, and then building complexity back into a solution until you get to the point where you've got enough that you can stop. You've tested the hypothesis and you've delivered something that is actually good enough, and actually you can stop work, quit while you're ahead, if you like.
Fantastic.
So I want to jump in on that comment about the skyscraper. So, I mean, because Agile is very similar to Lean, and Lean manufacturing is a big thing that they use to build Heathrow Terminal 5. But what you could do is, as you're building a skyscraper, you can actually build your foundations deeper than they perhaps need to be, to a little modest extra bit of cost. And then as you're building your skyscraper and you're selling the floors, if you discover, and you do the design such that if you discover that actually it's more popular than you thought, you can add an extra few floors than you originally intended on the top. You can't do that if you've planned everything up front.
Yeah,
I guess
you probably wouldn't iterate so much, though, would you? So software and business process is more malleable. You can change it more easily. Once you've built a certain floor, you can maybe move the partitions around inside. We're probably stretching the analogy a little.
Yeah. But it's funny you should say that, because my former boss's favourite book on architecture IT architecture is about buildings, called How Buildings Learn. And that is exactly the thing. What it does is it identifies what are the things you can change and what are the things that are harder to change. So you can repaint the colours. That's easy to do. But moving the walls is harder. Changing the facade is harder, but we still see places in the city where they've kind of reskinned a skyscraper. But the
adding
hardest,
windows.
But the one thing that you can't do is move its location.
Absolutely. So
And actually, that analogy actually works well with a lot of large-scale organisations where, I call it the goalposts. The goalposts are fixed. They've already decided that this is what you're going to build, but actually all the detail about what it looks like, how it works, how it affects people, how people live and breathe in that building, if you like to use that analogy, is all not known. So there's still lots of things that can be done in a very agile and iterative way, but the goalpost about the fact that it's got to be 5 stories, that it's got to be so many cubic square foot, that's fixed.
And it's interesting that this analogy I love. It almost feels like a series of blog posts, because didn't the Empire State Building famously put the big spiky bit on afterwards? So it would remain the tallest building. I don't know whether that's an urban legend or not.
I heard that.
But anyway, so great conversation there. I just want to get a couple of last questions in, or 2 or 3 if we can. So with these, if I could ask for just like the shortest possible answer that possible, so we can get through as many as possible. Chris, I'm going to invite you to answer this one. To what degree do you think templates can support or harm agile analysis practices?
My view, templates should only be used in the presence of a master practitioner who can tell you when they're going to cause you to fail.
So about the experience, having the experience to read the context, I guess, in that regard. So
otherwise, because templates are great in the obvious domain where you know everything, but it's very easy to actually tip into chaos because you've just filled in the template and you miss the key requirements as a result.
And your objective suddenly becomes to fill in the template rather than to think about the value you're delivering.
It becomes documentation for documentation's sake. So, okay. Next question. I'm going to invite Tony to answer this one, because I think this might be your, or maybe your area, or Lynn might have a view on this as well. Have you seen any good examples of reconciling agile software development with public sector procurement, budgeting, and governance overheads? What made it a success? And being succinct if you can, Tony, and or Lynn and Chris, if you have experience in that area. Well, I know Lynn does.
Well, I've never really seen it work that well. I'm in public sector at the minute, and thankfully the procurement process is time and materials. And there's a kind of vague pretense of scoping out work, but realistically we have teams, and teams are of a certain size, and they deliver stuff using sprints and velocity. So thankfully some parts of the public sector are now using that model, which allows us to deliver more flexibly better value.
And by success, does that mean that they're more successful than the Accenture 28 billion patient records project?
Well, hopefully anyway. Time perhaps will tell.
I think having worked in the public sector most of my career, I think the procurement organisations haven't really caught up quite enough with Agile yet. They don't really, even though they use the word, they pay a lot of lip service to it. So they'll say they're going to do procurement in an Agile way, and maybe they do some fixed price contracts, and maybe there are 3 or 4 sets of fixed price contract with their fixed outcomes, and then they still ask for upfront requirements. They still ask for the detailed plans, and so they want to do the right thing, but they don't understand what they're trying to achieve, so they end up driving the wrong behavior, and you end up as a contractor working in the government, you can end up spending more time trying to satisfy the procurement people that you're doing the right thing than actually demonstrating that you're doing the right thing.
Absolutely, there's some real irony there. So fantastic. And then this really is the last question, and again, just a sentence or a key phrase on this. So the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, just over a month away, defines that we have to have privacy by default. Can that work in Agile, and how? I'll open that to whoever wants to speak first.
Well, we've done that. So we've done our GDPR stuff quite recently and quite quickly in the space of a few sprints. And going forward now, GDPR is built into our definition of done, or even definition of ready. So for each story, we have a quick think, is there any privacy impact on this? If so, then let's think about what we need to do to make it GDPR compliant, story by story as we go.
Fantastic, fantastic. So there we must leave it. But I will ask for just a final closing thought from each of you on just any of the topics we've talked about, or things that we should all be thinking about as, practitioners in the sort of, in the world we live in today. So Lynn, any final closing thoughts?
Well, I did have a thought earlier about, we were talking about business analysis not being a role. But actually, I think we also need to remember that product owner is a role, not a profession as well. And I think we not to put all our eggs in one basket there. I think if we want to talk about professions that bring a lot of these things together, we should be looking around product management and not product ownership, which is a role that can, that somebody that's got business analysis skills can quite rightly fill in the right environment.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lynda. Chris, final thoughts?
I think Lynda and Tony are great.
I think we can all agree with that.
Well,
as are you, Chris.
That's it. Over to Tony.
Okay.
I think Chris is great. I think I'm great. No, mine is about team. Okay, so BAs, I think historically have been used to working on their own and handing stuff over to a different team. And the experience that I have as an Agile BA, and I'm getting better. I'm still learning about this, because I still have a tendency to want to go and hide myself away and work things out. But the team is greater than the sum of its parts. So our team, we know we're really flying when we come out of a Three Amigos session, like a collaborative design session, where we realize that everybody contributed something, and the thing that came out of that, the design that came out of that, was only possible because everyone was there: developers, QAs, BA, UX designer, user researcher, content designer, product owner, everybody contributing from their own perspective, with team safety, everybody respecting one another's opinions, pushing a little bit in their direction, but getting a compromise story design that's just hits the sweet spot between all of those things: user experience, cost, simplicity, complexity, all of those things. So the team is bigger than the sum of its parts.
So Adrian, I've now finally thought of something proper to say.
Fantastic. Please go ahead.
There's a question earlier that went to Lynda, I think, and it was like, what is the key skill? And I think the key skill for a BA in Agile now and kind of in the modern times is to enjoy learning, and to see every kind of opportunity as a learning opportunity. Because so often as an Agile coach, I'll go out there and I'll encounter BAs and they go, I don't need to learn anything, I know how to do it. And there's just so many fun things to learn out there that that's the thing. Enjoy learning and have fun doing it. Fantastic,
and what a great point to close the webinar. So well, thank you very much. So a massive thank you to Lynda, to Chris, and to Tony for taking time out of I know you have busy schedules, taking time out to be on the panel this evening. I know from the number of questions that have come in that people have found this a really useful session. So thank you for being part of this. And thank you very much to everyone who has tuned in. As a reminder, the whole ethos behind these BA community webinars is to really encourage conversations in the BA community about topics that are of interest and perhaps that aren't being covered, being covered elsewhere. Shortly after the webinar, you will get an email survey. I'd really appreciate it. It's just like 2 or 3 questions. We'd really appreciate it if you could fill that in, but also suggest any topics that you want to see in future webinars. In fact, the reason we had this Agile webinar was that so many people were asking for it. So please do pop any suggestions you have in there. Also, you will get a link to our next webinar. Our next webinar is actually in just about a month's time, and it's around powerful, persuasive presentations for BAs. So Gavin Meikle is going to be talking about how to make a really compelling presentation, how to communicate really, really well. So do register early for that one. I'm pretty sure it'll be a popular one as well. So thank you once again to our speakers, to Lynda, Chris, Tony. Thanks to everyone who attended. Have a great evening and look forward to catching up with you all soon.
Thanks, Adrian.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, both. Bye.